occasionally you find that a wooden beam, which originally probably started on the steps and went through Bernini's central vault here to help support those hanging vaults, the old hanging vaults here, these would be then sawed away, just chopped away so that they would not add to the weight of that situation. You take the vault, the timber down here, you saw away what's above it so that there's no additional weight on top. What's interesting is this little wall right here, or what is the remains of a wall. It's really going down the spine of the current Scala Regia, directly underneath the Sala Regia. It's going right along here. A further sign of that same wall along the spine of the Scala Regia is something that you can see here. Now, we mentioned that the width of the Scala at the doppio ripiano on the GDSU 572 was about 16.5 palmi. That is the same dimension, as I mentioned, for Bernini's Scala Regia up at the top, the width of the staircase up at the top. What's interesting is that the width of Bernini's Scala Regia is, as far as I'm translating all of this into Roman palmi, 37 palmi, so it's a little more than twice the width of what's up above. And you get, I hope you get where I'm going. That's twice the width of this. If you were to build a wall down the center of Bernini's Scala Regia, it would correspond with these remains that I'm finding on top. And if that's true, those logically are the remains of Bramante's Via Julia Nova. There's no other reason why they would be there, none whatsoever. They're not doing anything for Bernini's work. They're certainly not doing anything for the vaults that were interrupted. And, of course, they are themselves broken. Then there's some other tantalizing details. If we look back on this side of the crawl space, we see a wall above these columns. It's this wall here. And if you climb through the space, you can see the other side of that wall here, which enables you to realize that this is the same arch. This arch, number 3, is in front, closest to the photographer, me, here. And it is very clearly a 17th century construction. It's what 17th century construction looked like. Very, very rough, but it's there. Whereas this masonry, which is brick masonry, below and behind the 17th century masonry, is much finer. The brick is thinner, it's longer, and everything about it says Cinquecento. Behind that is another system of brick that does not correspond to the intermediate one. This arch here and this arch here do not correspond. They don't correspond in plane, and they don't correspond in curvature. They must date from a different campaign. The only other campaign that we know about would be Bramante's. My interpretation of this material is that number 1 on my scheme is a partial remain of Bramante's Via Giulia Nuova. Number 2 on the scheme, still in Cinquecento brick masonry. It would have been put up when San Gallo was reinforcing the walls underneath the enlargement of the Sala Regia above this site. And the third campaign, shall we say, of brick, which is very rough, very rugged, completely of a different character, would be Bernini's. Let me see. All of this seems to me to be telling me that the Julian staircase was just as impressive in its size and in its engineering as Bernini's would be. That is to say, it tunneled right up in the same way that Bernini's would do later, and which I thought was all that was happening there. I now believe differently. I think that the audacity of the idea of tunneling through this pre-existing room is one of the reasons why Bernini was hesitant to change anything, even to touch anything having to do with Bramante's staircase. A hesitation that's documented in his drawings, I think we can prove, and in later accounts of his work. He was particularly sensitive about issues of engineering following the disaster of the tower, the facade tower of St. Peter's, which had, of course, to be demolished. So he was a little sensitive on these points. Let me just conclude, because, oh dear. I still think that Borromini's Spada colonnade of 1653 is Bernini's main inspiration. Here's the concept of the inganno dell'occhio, which would give rise to that notion of the vanity of earthly experience and the false testimony of the senses, and the importance, by contrast, of spiritual or non-material values. The colonnade itself, by Borromini, is indebted to the concept that was realized, of course, by Bramante in the false choir of Santa Maria presso San Satero, which developed itself from a Eucharistic tabernacle tradition that goes back to Desiderio and Rossellino and Amadeo and Mino and Bregno and so forth, and which was still alive, the prospective tabernacle tradition, in the 17th century, as we see on the altar of San Paolo Maggiore in Bologna, where Bernini actually worked. To be sure, Bernini incorporated site-specific associations at the new Scala Regia. His trumpeting fames clearly allude to the trombetti of the old palace, now part of history, but a part of living history that had been remembered. And Falda's view of the new stairs, engraved before the staircase was completed, terminates at the double landing in a view of a garden with fountains, perhaps an allusion to the Paradiso that's exactly on that level, that quota of the palace. But all of this, in my opinion now, begs the essential novelty of the staircase. is the essential novelty of the staircase consists of the columns. Where does the idea of a staircase lined by columns of diminishing scale come from? A staircase lined by columns of diminishing scale. Although this association has never been made, I think that the inspiration is obvious, for it is here that we have a staircase lined by columns whose girth and height diminish with the ascent. Bramante's spiral coronata indeed offers a conspicuous precedent from Bernini's entire concetto. Here is the notion of the human versus the architectural scale as it varies from the bottom to the top. It is Bernini's appropriation of this idea that is full of papal associations, yet it is yet in its very composition is obviously meant as a polemical and I would say provocational point of view. As one ascends the coronata, the architectural context seems to shrink, and at the summit, which is the context of the papal villa and a view over the papal gardens, these are the things that subsume and replace all other concerns. Here, as in other instances, I think that Bernini was uniquely able to extract the essential lesson of his model, which was not the invocation of Vitruvian or Albertian orders, but instead the application of the column form to a ramp or stairs. Instead of looking at Bramante's cordonata, as most of us do today, for those inconsistencies of the pairings of capitals and proportions, Bernini looked at the one element of design that was consistent, regular, predictable, and provocative: the diminution of the column shafts from the bottom to the top. Only then could Bernini ask what ideas he could bring to enrich this cadence, the suggestive and to us inexplicable combination of capitals and bases, which are so prevalent in medieval Roman churches, did not distract Bernini from recognizing an essential and consistent ingredient of the spiral coordinata. In retrospect, it's interesting that Bernini, and Bernini alone, latched on to this idea. Leonardo, who lived at the Belvedere at the time, certainly knew Bramante's design, but he appears not to have been fully interested in it, nor were his associates in the court of Francis I at Blois, where, again, there's no particular interest in the development of the orders from bottom to top, or at Chambord, where the same thing is true. You have this stilted pilaster here, just as one example. There's simply no interest in making the orders in any consistent way in the manner that Bramante originally did. It hadn't interested Francesco di Giorgio in Urbino. It hadn't interested Vignola at Caprarola later, or Borromini at Palazzo Barberini. In 1536, Johannes Ficard visited the palace and described how from the gardens of the Vatican Palace one could ascend a spiral staircase and from the top of it enjoy one of the most wonderful and paradisical views of the entire complex. This was exactly as Falda had pictured Bernini's Scala Regia. Perhaps one knew then better than now how one architect honors another, avoiding emulation, but instead indulging in appropriation, fully digested and happily disguised. Thank you.
Grazie Tod per questo bellissimo contributo inaspettato con queste cose. È straordinario che cosa si può ancora trovare guardando dietro i muri. No, adesso, secondo il programma, ho il grande piacere di pregare il professor Fromme di venire. No, qui sul programma l'hanno messo la discussione finale dopo le sue conclusioni, ma possiamo forse cominciare con discutere il contributo e dopo lei conclude i lavori.
No, io ho un po' dubbi se sia la Scala, tutto quello convincente che tu hai detto sui muri e così via, ma non credo che sia stata ugualmente splendida come quella di Bernini, perché anche la rampa inferiore, che sicuramente andava sotto la Scala Regia poi per arrivare a questa altezza, era stretta come quella superiore, che è più o meno ancora quella di Bramante, no? Non c'era luce da sopra e probabilmente era una scala per cavalli, perciò c'è questa cosa radiale al pianerottoli, cioè molto più funzionale e molto meno regia, no?
It's possible, and here's what I think the argument would depend on. If those are the walls that belong to Bramante's Via Giulia Nova, let's say they are for a moment, then they either go down much lower than Bernini's vaults, or they didn't. It's got to be one or the other. Of course. But failing that, and for the moment, they either come down and the whole space is used, or it wasn't. And it seems to me, I think that he did. I think this was one of the great sort of underestimated achievements of Bramante, and one of the reasons why Bernini at first did not want to touch this. Just leave it the way it is. It's fine the way it is. It was very accommodating, as you point out, for horses, and Bernini's would not be. But it would just be a matter of opinion. I still have to believe that if reliefs, if drawings show us that is the wall, and measurements, more accurate measurements would tell us, then the walls either go way down and there are vaults on those, or all the space was used. But not for that part of the staircase.
Comunque quello che devo aggiungere ancora, quello che ho detto ieri sulla grande scala di Castel Sant'Angelo, naturalmente è molto paragonabile, no? Questa lunghissima asse per cavalli con la finestra infine.
Absolutely, positively, yeah, no question about it. I have to say, quite honestly, I myself rejected this notion when I published my book. I didn't believe it. And now I'm finding there are more arguments in favor of it than there are against it. So, at a certain point...
E tu sai che c'è un'altra scala, ancora 1000 volte più monumentale, che sale dal cortile Belvedere. Possiamo vedere ancora un momentino 287?
Oh, shit. I just pulled it off. Which one did you want?
280, tantissimo disegno. Vedete, si entrava qua, quello sarebbe non più l'accesso principale, ma quel cortile che è scritto bene, poi si arriva al cortile Belvedere, e questo sarebbe il lato sud del cortile Belvedere, e tu vedi che qui sale questa scala, qua comincia, sala fino all'appartamento Boccia con rampe 3 volte più larghe.
Absolutely. Right.
Questa è la scala ufficiale, no? E l'altra è quella più...
Would have been. Yeah. No, and I absolutely. There's no question because there's no comparison with scale, absolutely. But as it wasn't done, it has no effect on Bernini. Sure, absolutely. But as none of that was done, the point is that it has nothing to do with Bernini. Thank you for making this assignment specific.
Riguardo alla gerarchia delle scale, però bisogna considerare che erano diversi i modi con cui venivano usate, cioè serviva comunque una scala che conducesse dalla Cappella Pontificia alla Scala Regia il corteo pontificio in quelle occasioni annuali nel quale il Papa doveva uscire dai propri palazzi e affacciarsi alla città. Quindi a prescindere dalle dimensioni, la scala, la via Iulia ha un'importanza processionale diversa rispetto alla scala magnifica che dava però su uno spazio che era uno spazio di svago, sostanzialmente di rappresentazione sociale, però meno ufficiale rispetto a questo apparizione.
Sul disegno grandissimo.
Sì,
ha
cioè
ragione.
hanno un livello simbolico diverso a prescindere dalle loro
Si deve
dimensioni.
tenere conto del fatto che c'è una cerimoniale
Sì.
e si deve seguire la cerimoniale sempre.
Del resto, cioè le forme della Scala
per
Regia.
quello non esiste una parola
Quello è
dal cerimoniere.
Erano diciamo cerimoniali probabilmente privati che erano ugualmente importanti, però di diciamo simbolicità diversa rispetto a quelli ufficiali, istituzionali del pontefice che appare in cima a questa scala, deve essere visto dal popolo e nella versione berniniana viene incorniciato appunto da un simbolo imperiale che è la serliana.
This would be the problem. I mean, it's another problem to work out, an interesting one. But if this becomes the main entrance, and I have no doubt that plan suggests that it is going to become the main entrance if it's built, then how does the ceremonial work? The ceremonial either has to be rewritten or violated, or it's every single event, papal event in the liturgical year and non-papal event, by the way, is written for stairs that are here. Patrizio Piccolomini had nothing to say about this because he didn't know it existed. He was writing before.
Non credo che il popolo abbia visto il Papa sulla via Giulia.
Actually,
Non credo.
Federico makes an interesting point. You know, there's something about all of these staircases that it doesn't get mentioned too often, except in France, which is the notion that the arrival of someone, or the departure of someone, or the greeting of someone becomes in those compositions a public and visible event. And this is one of the interesting aspects, I think, of Bramante's Cordonata, that it becomes a visible event. I've tried to make the argument for completely different reasons that the same thing was true with Bernini's Scala Regia, which has niches all the way up the side walls. For what? Not for statues, either for Swiss guards or maybe a virtual observer, the observer that's supposed to be there.
È una tipica, mi sembra, epifania barocca, cioè chi stava sotto vedeva il Papa apparire in sedia gestatoria illuminato, perché Bernini è un tecnico delle luci, insomma, no? Quindi appare subito illuminato, una scala maggiore di quella umana perché la riduzione prospettica lo rendeva più grande. E piano piano questo corteo, con tutti i suoi spettacolari partecipanti, scendeva. E c'era un canale visivo però che univa l'imbocco della Scala Regia fino all'imbocco di Ponte Sant'Angelo, cioè che Bernini addirittura rimarca, demolisce per poter conservare questa visione addirittura al Ponte Sant'Angelo, fino a quando poi il grande Piacentini l'ha chiuso con quella idea geniale, perché insomma bisogna...
non Bramante.
anche, no, certo, non Bramante, no, questo no, perché anche i criminali hanno un genio, quindi... Anche...
I should stop. A proposito, I think that Bernini was absolutely aware of all the ideas, these ideas that Julius II proposed. One being that plan, which was actually begun and carried out, to make a straight avenue from the Castello to the portal of the Palazzo, which you published documents for from 1512, and that's an idea of a straight street leading right to the entrance to the palace. Yeah, but as we know from the document that you made available to us, he had to straighten it, as the document says, make it shorter, meaning make it straighter, and that's certainly what Bernini does. He makes the Borgo Nuovo go straight to the Portone di Bronzo, which goes straight through the corridor, the north corridor, which goes straight up the staircase. It's
Allora, non vedo più mani alzati, allora possiamo concludere questa discussione molto interessante e prego il professor Frommel di venire qui sul podio per la conclusione del convegno.